and then get into a discussion based on the three materials that you are going to go over. So do we have the link? So I'll request Elijah, would you mind maybe the article? Would you mind maybe reading it through for us? Yeah, that one.
I start.
Okay.
Okay, so pilot Zambian debt relief collapses. Interesting. So failure of the protracted negotiations casts doubt on the G20 common framework for debt treatment. Zambia's imploding deals for debt relief from its member creditors have plunged the country's fragile economic recovery into uncertainty. It also raises serious doubt over the G20 common framework for debt treatment, for which Zambia was the main test case. Last year, Zambia's government secured a provisional deal to restructure $6.3 billion of debt from official creditors, including China, France, and India. As a result, the International Monetary Fund agreed to lend Zambia $1.3 billion because it deemed that the forgiveness of a substantial part of its $13.25 billion external debt had salvaged Zambia from its debt trap and made its repayments sustainable. Then in October, Zambia did a separate restructuring deal with private bondholders for another $3 billion of debt. That looked for a moment like encouraging further progress, and the IMF approved it. But in November, the official creditors complained that the bondholders got a better deal than they had, 18 cents more on the dollar. So the Zambian government pulled out of the bondholder deal, and both agreements now seem to have collapsed. So the failure is a cruel blow to Zambian President Hakainde Hichilema, who inherited a huge debt overhang totaling over $25 billion if you include domestic loans from his spendthrift predecessor Edgar Lungu. The latter took out large loans from China and others to build largely unnecessary infrastructure. Zambia defaulted on its external debt 3 years ago, and since then, Hichilema has been struggling to escape the debt trap by seeking debt relief and fiscal prudence. Continue. Okay, so the dispute over the Zambian deals suggests the Paris Club's comparability of treatment isn't working. But the opaque complexities of debt relief negotiations, including some suspect creditors' hidden ulterior motives, seem to have defeated him, at least for now. The failure of Hichilema's efforts also raises doubts about the workability of the common framework that the G20 and the Paris Club of Government creditors established in 2020 to rescue countries plunged into debt by COVID-19's economic impact. So under the comparability of treatment principles set up in the Paris Club, all creditors should take the same basic loss. However, the Zambian case has shown that this is difficult, partly because the negotiations are secret, which precludes reliable comparisons of different treatments. The government lenders who formed the creditor committee, co-chaired by China and France and deputy-chaired by South Africa, sank the recent bondholder deal because they said the bondholders would be given 18 cents more on the dollar than they were offered. So bondholders countered this by saying they had offered more debt relief than the bilateral lenders on a net present value basis, and that had taken principal haircuts of 18% when official creditors took none. So there are no guidelines for mapping the debt treatment process under the G20 common framework. So those are substantially different claims that should be verified. Calculating on the net present value is supposed to enable the comparison of different deals on different loans with varying maturation periods by removing inflation from the equation. But the dispute over the two Zambian deals suggests comparability of treatment isn't working. And of course, it's complicated. As the Reuters analysis noted that Telling different creditors' priorities is tricky. Bondholders target shorter-term cash flows, but will accept principal write-downs, while official creditors favor maturity extensions. Much of the problem is that there are no guidelines for mapping the debt treatment process under the common framework, says Marianne L. Nkunika Liandamina, a senior economist in the Zambian Ministry of Finance and National Development. In the meantime, it's the experience from Chad, Ethiopia, and Zambia that will serve as reference points for other countries, as she continued in September 2022 paper. Then she also cited the other two countries that were then wrestling with debt relief negotiations under the common framework. It may be beneficial to set up guidelines under the current framework and any other similar initiatives that may be conceived in the future. So Zambia's case set a precedence for other indebted countries to follow, such as Chad, Ethiopia, and Ghana. So the prevailing consensus among commentators is that the transparency is part of the remedy. Danny Bredlaw of the University of Pretoria has argued that Zambia should propose that all its creditors agree to meet with it in one forum and make one agreement dealing with all its debt obligations. While this will no doubt complicate negotiations, it will improve the transparency of the process. It will also give each group of creditors confidence that they are all receiving comparable treatment. It's hard to argue with transparency. However, in an interview with ISS today, Simon Wolf of Malo Global raised legitimate doubts about whether transparency could resolve the Zambian dispute or any future debt relief deals. So the question is whether bilateral creditors, heavily represented by China, and private creditors can agree on the comparability of treatment retroactively. You know, debt was afforded to Zambia on different terms to start with. It's unreasonable to expect that all new loans will need to be pre-approved by all possible lenders in the likely or unlikely event that the country may be unable to service its debt in the future. Perhaps because that expectation seems improbable, Wolf suspects it's likely that China is flexible. It's flexing its muscles to that sovereign bondholders pay heavier price. In any case, Wolf agrees with others that the Zambian debt restructuring is a test case for the new common framework and will set a precedent for other indebted countries to follow. That so far means Chad, Ethiopia, and recently Ghana. At the very least, the Zambian case needs to be studied carefully to extract guidelines for others to follow, and which Zambia itself could use to salvage its debt relief. So meanwhile, Zambia says the government intends to continue discussions in good faith and all relevant parties on how it can reach a successful and comprehensive debt restructuring. Then we have Peter Fabricius, a consultant at ISS Pretoria.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
those are just
Oh, it's done.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much. We can clap for him. That was a long read.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Elijah. Maybe then we can go to the two videos. As they sort that out, would you like to nominate maybe as a secretary to the group? Someone who can note down maybe what we discussed for later.
Now this
Sharon? Okay.
week, Zambia's dollar debt plunged after official creditors, co-led by China and France, rejected a revised bondholder restructuring proposal, stalling the revamp of $3 billion of outstanding notes. Zambia's central bank, this week as well, that was yesterday, raised its benchmark interest rate by the most in 4 years to tame stubborn inflation and support the currency. The Monetary Policy Committee lifted the rate to 11% from 10%, and that's the biggest increase since November 2019. We have Orson Gard, is the Sub-Saharan Africa analyst at BMI, a Fitch Solutions company. He joins us from the UK to share his insights. Good afternoon, Orson. It's good to have you on the program. But what does this mean? What does this mean? Everything's happening in Zambia right now. What does this mean for the broader debt restructuring program?
Thank you very much for having me. Well, like you've mentioned, this is certainly a setback, and markets have reacted as such, with yields on Zambia's 2027 Eurobond spiking in response to the statement released by the official creditor committee on Monday. and the Zambian kwacha, its currency, has also continued its streak of losses. Despite this initial reaction, though, at BMI we do hold the view that this setback will have a limited material impact on Zambia's debt restructuring programme, as well as the economy more broadly. So it's critical to remember that the deal reached in June with official creditors to restructure $6.3 billion of Zambia's external debt was solidified with a memorandum of understanding at the IMF's annual meetings in October. So this portion of the programme has almost certainly been settled at this point. I think it's also important to consider why official creditors rejected the debt treatment proposed by commercial bondholders. They rejected the deal based on this notion of comparability of treatment, or in other words, the idea that different creditor groups should offer similar terms. So according to the official creditor committee, government creditors are providing a much more favourable repayment schedule and are therefore assuming a lot more risk.
Does this setback call into question the efficacy of the G20 common framework, Orson?
In short, yes, it does. Although if we look at what the G20 common framework was designed to do and what it's actually achieved to date, it's quite clear that the efficacy, as you put it, of the framework could have been questioned long before this most recent setback. So the G20 common framework was set up in 2020, and it was set up to coordinate debt restructuring between official and private creditors. And this was supposed to facilitate timely and orderly debt treatment for countries that had previously been eligible for relief under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And thus far, only 3 countries, so that's Zambia, Ghana and Chad, have sought support from the framework, and none of these have yet finalised a debt restructuring programme. And with regards to Zambia, it's important to note that a major obstacle has been the larger role that mainland China has played in the negotiations, with China approaching the talks in a very different way to the traditional Paris Club group of lenders. And while this dynamic isn't unique to Zambia, it's worth noting that, unlike in Ghana, for example, the majority of the country's bilateral debt is held by mainland China. And we think that this has very much contributed to the protracted nature of Zambia's restructuring programme. And in this case, it does suggest then that the G20 common framework really is struggling to reconcile the competing interests of different creditors, especially considering the emphasis they place on comparability of treatment.
Very interesting thing you pointed out there. But what strategies or alternatives might Zambia consider in addressing its economic challenges? Because it has to find a way to, work around this problem following this setback.
So yeah, as I mentioned, we don't actually expect this setback to have a major impact on Zambia's economy per se, but you are right in saying that the country is facing a number of economic challenges. So inflation is on the rise again, as you mentioned, and this is being driven by the continued weakening of the country's currency, the kwacha, which so far this year has actually been one of the world's worst performing currencies. And as you mentioned, we saw yesterday the Bank of Zambia hiking its policy rate by 100 basis points to 11%, which suggests that higher inflation is forcing policymakers to tighten policy at a faster pace, and that's a move that we think will cap credit demand over the coming quarters. And also, as I recently highlighted in a webinar on emerging fiscal risks across sub-Saharan Africa as a whole, it is likely that governments across the region will be forced to lean more heavily on domestic sources of credit as they remain locked out of international credit markets. So as Zambia and other African governments continue to run budget deficits in the medium term, this scenario is very likely to play out as the Zambian government seeks to plug the gap in its budget.
Thank you so much, Orson Gad, analyst Sub-Saharan Africa with BMI. Thank you for sharing your insights on Business Incorporated.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And our next story is about China's murky web of bribery, a tool that it often uses in return for favors. But who exactly does China bribe? Anyone willing to do its bidding, be it heads of global bodies, chairpersons of global banks, even world leaders. You heard that right. Just have a look at what happened in Zambia recently. The country's foreign minister has resigned. Why? Because of his alleged business dealings with Beijing. According to reports, Stanley Kakubo was involved in corruption with a Chinese businessman. The allegations emerged after a video surfaced on social media. The video essentially showed 2 people counting cash stacked upon a table.
Good. 16, 40. Yeah. So, depending on 50, how much? My 50.
Yes, 50,000.
So 50.
100, 200, 300, 400, 500.
So what was this cash meant for? How much was it? Who was counting it? Well, the cash was apparently a hefty sum of $100,000. It was secretly exchanged between a Chinese and a Zambian mining firm. The deal was apparently orchestrated by the Zambian foreign minister. It is not clear if he himself was counting the cash. But this video triggered a social media frenzy, with many Zambians accusing Kakubo of corruption. Before the controversy could spiral out of control, the 43-year-old Kakubo, who had been Zambia's foreign minister since 2021, put down his papers. And what reason did he cite for that resignation? Well, he said he was quitting because of quote-unquote malicious claims over a business transaction. This is what his full statement read. In view of the matter that is currently in the media regarding malicious claims over a business transaction between my private family business and our business partner with whom we still have good relations. The office of the Zambian president was quick to acknowledge the resignation. Here's what it said in a statement. The president has accepted the resignation of the Honorable Stanley Kakubo from his cabinet position as Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. The president acknowledges the commendable work and leadership. And what has China said on all of this? Well, last we checked, the Chinese side had not issued a statement. And why would it? When its covert and corrupt dealings have been exposed. And what's worse, this is not the first time China has been accused of bribing a foreign leader. In fact, in March this year, the outgoing leader of the Federated States of Micronesia, which is by far one of the world's tiniest countries, had accused China of bribing the officials and making direct threats against his personal safety. Former President David Panolo had issued a 13-page letter in which he blamed China for carrying out a campaign of political warfare, which included activities like bribery, psychological warfare, blackmail. He said that Beijing did so to achieve its long-term goal of taking over Taiwan. Let me quote the most interesting excerpt from that statement. What else do you call it when an elected official is given an envelope filled with money after a meal at the PRC embassy or after an inauguration? What else do you call it when a senior official is discreetly given a smartphone after visiting Beijing? And next we have the Solomon Islands. In the year 2019, the lawmakers claimed that they were offered bribes worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to gain their support on Taiwan. In other words, they were asked to make a diplomatic switch from Taipei to Beijing in exchange for money. Many opposition MPs said that such dealings were an open secret in the country's parliament. And you know the most shocking bit here? China has also been accused of trying to corrupt the United Nations. In the year 2018, a Chinese real estate developer from Macau was accused of bribing the former UN ambassador to the Dominican Republic. His name, Francis Lorenzo. He had pleaded guilty to taking bribes in return for getting projects approved. Can you believe that? And a year before this, in the year 2017, the head of a Hong Kong-based NGO was accused of bribing the former foreign minister of Senegal. What for, you ask? The same reason, getting Chinese projects approved in Senegal. And these, by the way, were just a few examples. There are many more instances of China bribing world leaders, and many more instances of China getting caught in doing so. The Chinese state has made a habit, it seems, of using money to establish diplomatic ties and infiltrating various sectors in comparatively smaller nations. It's about time that global bodies get Beijing to task for such wretched affairs. We are now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the updates on
I don't know about you, but the questions I'm asking is all the Chinese in my country, what is at stake? So with this session, at the end of it, we've been looking at Zambia. If you were to design a debt sustainable financial model for Zambia, I want us, even as we go through the questions, to think, what would that look like? Because at the end of the session, we are going to try and do that. So we're going to look at some of these questions and answer them as we go. So in your own analysis, how did Zambia fall into the debt trap? So anyone can go. In your own analysis, given what we just watched and what we went, the article that we went through, how did Zambia fall into the debt trap? Any hands? Anyone who wants to go?
Since I'm from Zambia, I want to go
Yeah.
first. No, I'll let other people go first.
Okay.
I was just going to say, isn't it what we've been discussing over the past one day and maybe today? That we are within an economic and financial system and structure that is designed to extract particularly from the global south. And so we find ourselves in deals and in platforms and in places where we never have the upper hand. And so we end up playing with black belts and whatnot. And so, of course, we always get the short end of things. Yeah. So I think that would answer that.
Thank you. Anyone else who wants to build on it or has a different angle?
For me, the answer is bad governance. If you look at the level of corruption that, like it was described in the video, so that shows that the authorities, they're not talking about being the solvency of the state or the capacity to service their debt. That's for me, the answer is actually simply bad governance.
All right, so the system is not working for us, and the leaders are not even trying to make it work for us, in short. Anyone else who wants to go? Yes, Nalendi.
My answer is really based on what we've seen, right? So I think earlier or yesterday we spoke about the issue of accountability, right? So the issue, I mean, it's linked to what our brother's saying there about, bad governance. But just thinking about one of the comments on the video was that it was unnecessary infrastructure projects. What was the level of approval and oversight on such projects? And for it to have been approved, sort of what was the system of that and what were the accountability measures? Yeah.
All right, so lack of transparency and accountability in the process, in short. All right, yes, anyone here? Yes, Elijah?
Yeah, and now I think I can add. Yeah, so I totally agree with what she has said and also what Maria also pointed out. So I think what was happening, especially under the previous regime, yes, I know infrastructure is important, but they were inflating. There were also instances of inflating even the figures for some of the infrastructure projects that they were carrying out. So I think it narrows down to lack of, accountability, as she said, and also just mismanagement of the resources as well. But also, I think I'm also looking at what we discussed yesterday about how our economic, structure is also captured. Like, for example, we are looking at the former Minister of Foreign Affairs. So, like, we have the key companies that we have in the mining sector that are controlled by foreign investors. So I understand that not every foreign investor is a bad person. Like when you talk about mining, because mining by nature is capital intensive, right? So we need a lot of capital. So it will be a combination of both Zambians or Africans, but also other investors who would come. But what we had in the past, for the last 7 years or so in Zambia was we had almost all our mining companies were controlled by the foreigners, the foreign investors themselves. And, we didn't have any say, So, but also there were deals like what you saw. So in exchange for the mining companies and mining deals, the government and government officials themselves, they were getting bribes, and, also just misallocating the resources that they had contracted in terms of bonds. So I think it was a combination of all of those. But again, as I think about this in light of what we have discussed, because they were saying, is it a trick or a... Yes, then that keep on just ringing in my mind. Yes, I know for sure that there was wasteful expenditure, misallocation, and also lack of transparency. But is it... yes, yeah, so, but that...
Yes, Martin?
I feel like getting tired because what is happening for Zambia is something that is happening almost everywhere in Africa. And if you have a country where this has not happened yet, then the time will come when it happens. I think you said it. It's just about not having the capacity to manage small, but planning big. It becomes unbearable. That is the way you plan. The structure of our economies has nothing to do with the reality of our needs from the grassroots. I think we should start from there. What is the point for you going out to borrow when you haven't assessed your needs well? That's why you end up bringing in people with capital with the idea that they will come and invest in your mining sector, and you fail to follow up with that. So I think Zambia would have done better to start small. I remember a Zambian, we were in a meeting somewhere, and he said the best way for Zambia to use their natural resources is to keep these on the ground. Meaning that if nothing had happened in terms of investing in Zambia, Zambia wouldn't have been in the debt distress where they are today. So I think it's about time we look at the way we structure our economies in terms of looking just for what is essentially necessary for our people, and then looking forward to increase and try to make our living better. So what I mean is that we need to change our mindset and think of a way which has nothing to do with us going out to look for resources. That is, we try to assess what we are able to generate ourselves, build our structure on that capacity before we then look if we can get things from outside. Because as we go out there bringing in things that are big, if it is not big enough, you cannot have this corruption that we are talking about. Yeah. If the level of resources were very small, you wouldn't have had all the corruption and what we saw in the videos. So I think it's about time for us to change the way we think our economies. Yeah. And the way we think our economies should be based on our real capacity to generate our resources, because there is no good outside there. Because you heard this morning that the tax system was made in such a way that it is other people's interest that is being served. Yeah. So we should be clear on our interests and then shape our economies according to our interests. And tomorrow we can see if we can step to another level. Thank you.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it's only fair that I would have observed it because I was an MP before. But I see the parliamentary system, there's a problem also. Because it means as a president, I can take as much debt as I want. When my term is gone, I'm gone. And whoever takes over is the one that will sit with that problem. So it's a problem for me. But I also, like at personal level, would you be taking, are there people who are in debt distress at personal level to that extent, because that's what I see there. Where you go to, we call them abomashonisa in South Africa. What do you call them, Francis, in Kenya? Loan sharks. So we are indebted to loan sharks, but also indebted to the bank. Because that's what's happening there. They have money. Well, it's official for both, but I mean, they have borrowed from private lenders, but they've also borrowed from, what's the second one? What is it called? The interstate one. Yeah. Thank you. So, and the conditions are not the same.
Yeah.
So if you try and solve this, these ones say, so it's almost like if your mashonisa says, I'll do this, Netbank says no, but you owe me too. You know, it's two different sets of people. So those are the two things I took away.
Yeah, okay. And I think also, Martin, you kind of answered the second question. Could it have been avoided? Is there anyone who would say maybe we can't avoid it? It's a necessary evil, yes?
So I'm afraid I would sound like a broken record because there's nothing we are talking now except maybe context, which is new because this is Zambia, because we've discussed these issues. So if you look at Zambia, for instance, Francis Kaka here spoke about the illicit financial flows, the challenges that are there. So if you track what Zambia has lost through illicit financial flows and the difficulties that are involved when it comes to the recovery of the recovery of stolen assets, it takes longer, far much longer than it is to restructure even the debt conversations that are taking place. So if you look at it from a legalistic point of view, there is an element of lawfare that is there, which is compromising the welfare system. And this lawfare system is a global tool that is designed to work against any country in the global south. So I look at Zambia, yes, I agree with you, Dongo, that there's better governance. Now they voted for a new governance, which is said to be better. But the output itself is marginal. It's marginal. We are not so bad as Africans that we can't produce good leaders. I look at Joe Biden as a Biden when he's giving a speech. You can really tell how bad you look at Trump. You understand? Look at the former Prime Minister of Britain, that Kuruku that was caught during COVID, doing whatever he was doing. Yes, the boring Johnson. Yeah. So all I'm saying is, if you look at the challenge is that when we look at Africa, we hold a magnifying lens to the mistakes. But if you look at the global leadership, we are not far much off in terms of governance system. This China that is said to be corrupting Africa is the same China that has got a prospering system back home. Yeah, so why I'm trying to bring this, just to let it boil and say, I think it could have been avoided if we are not just demanding a seat at the table, but if we are ready to turn the tables. There are so many species where we are being asked to come and negotiate and discuss and do this. I mean, we are from South Africa. In 1994, we were discussing about the transitioning, how it's going to happen. Zimbabwe in 1980, you understand. But up until now, we can't have our land freely. So for me, it's about not a seat at the table. I know it's a good step, but at the table, let's turn the tables, Francis. Let's have a seat at the table, but let's turn the tables, in my view.
Wow, Francis. Yeah.
One. For me, turning the table, Mkasiri, is crucial because honestly, being a former MP, this parliamentary system, in 94, we inherited the apartheid debt. Imagine the debt that was taken to tear gas you and kill you. You are saying you are a new democratic government, but you are inheriting the debt. Also, we need to check how many of us inherited the colonial debt too, at the point when we were said to be gaining independence. So there's something structured wrong for me in terms of the governmental systems.
Yeah. Is it avoidable? Yes. Just this weekend, we had a very good conversation about Zambia. In the Kaunda years, Zambia had a branch of its bank in the UK. All the money that was being paid for the, what is that mineral? Is it copper?
The scribe is missing that important input, so I hope someone is noting it down.
Yeah. So the copper that is being mined to date in Zambia, in the Kaunda years, that money was being deposited in a bank belonging to the Zambian government that was located in the UK. During that period, Zambia had 22 parastatals. They were all working. They were all very liquid. In fact, we say that Kaunda, with his limited education, did much more, he did better in his economic policies for Zambia than every subsequent government that has come. At what point did we close the bank accounts that were used to pay for the copper in the UK? Did we stop mining? We continued mining, but the money is being deposited elsewhere. Could we have avoided debt? Yes. At what point did we privatize government services in Zambia? We start losing more revenue, losing more resources. So it could have been avoided. What we are seeing now is just a symptom of what collapsed after KK left office.
Samantha, you had, all right.
Thank you. I was going to just speak to what Comrade Mukasiri said about the use of lawfare and how it's being used against the people, and as well as the parliamentary processes that Honorable mentioned, and how just the use of lawfare itself is then being used to stifle Parliament's voice in as far as the debt contraction processes are concerned, thereby stifling transparency and accountability. So there's a 2020 case that happened in Zambia. It was heard by the Constitutional Court in Zambia. And basically it was about parliamentary approval before loans are contracted. Now, when you look at the Constitution of Zambia, it will tell you that the Parliament shall approve loans before contraction. But the thing with law is there is great detail to the choice of words you use. So when you use shall, it's open to, okay, we may or may not do it, instead of must. When it's a must, then you should do it. And so it then becomes something so trivial, and yet everyone knows that the basic idea here is that there should be parliamentary approval before a loan is contracted. But you have lawyers, government lawyers arguing about this, and yet at the end of the day, we do not have the strengthening of our transparency and accountability measures. And so it's a question about also what are the kinds of people we have in power. The judiciary, for example, are they reasonable people? Because surely it should have been an obvious case. We need transparency and accountability measures strengthened, and that's through Parliament. So yeah.
All right, thank you. So we have a case study here, and it's not really a case study, but an example. So assume you're the president of Zambia, and you are with the most trusted comrades, and you want to co-construct a viable financial model for Zambia to take her out of her debt distress. So we are overturning the table, as Mukasiri would say. So how would this table look like from the other side? Yes, Martin.
If I'm the president of Zambia, and I hope I'm the president not elected, but a pure dictator, the first thing that I would do will be to try to get in touch with my mates, other presidents, because Zambia can do nothing as Zambia alone to get out of this trap, because it is a common trap for Africa. And the solution should come from a collective move. That table, Mukasiri, is very heavy. You can't turn it alone. To turn that table, you need to be many. And turning the table is not even enough. Abandon that table and use another table, which is your table. And I would try to get with my mates so that we shape a collective solution. And then I'll come back home, and that collective solution will look like what? It will look like what I was saying before. First of all, we find a way to get a debt servicing holiday. You heard me well. Debt servicing holiday. That is, collectively, we decide that this thing is too heavy for us. We stop paying first. We are going to pay, but we stop paying first. What is the point going out there looking for good rate? Somebody discussed rating. Being rated. Rated for what? Rated to go and get additional debt, right? So we go toward a solution where we have a debt servicing holiday. We try to restructure the little that we have. Then when we are better off, we start paying what we stopped paying, and we pay slowly. I know you will argue that how can you do that? You are not in control. Even where you are in control, all the solutions that we have where we are not in control and other people dictate the solution to us, where has that led us to? Nowhere. So we really need to think of designing a solution that comes from us. And remember this morning about the digging and piling. The only place where they dig is here. It means that we are the place where people want to come. It is something that we need to know. And I'm sure that when we turn the table, or when we go to another table, those people will come and follow us. They will run after us.
All right, so throw away the table and... Yes, sure, then Mukasiri.
Kasir. So here's the thing. You are not going to design as the Zambian president because you want to bring your other counterparts with you. But you don't need to answer. This is a rhetorical question. What in the electoral system of those countries makes citizens force their presidents to be Pan-African and look to the African continent?
Good question. Would you like to answer?
Yes.
Okay.
But that's what I'm looking for. That's what we want. Because what I'm saying is that Zambia, as Zambia alone, cannot find a sustainable solution. There is no way. You can bet with me, if Zambia, if it is an individual solution, that solution will not be sustainable. Because so far as Africa is not implementing its design about African financial institutions, we'll keep into that trap.
We'll remain the same. Okay, let me have Mukasiri, then you can go.
Yeah, for me, I would really cherish the position. Number one, I will start to remove the P. I will not be a president, just be a resident minister. This thing of English is confusing us. You owe your allegiance to the people. You are not a president. And they think they are superior. So that's number one for me. Remove the P, resident minister. Right. So the second issue now is to give power to the people. When we talk about public finance, the rights of the creditors have been superimposed on the rights of citizens. It's not, you are being said, go and participate in budget making processes and everything else, but it does not help now when all your resources have been taken. You know, it's literally, I think most of our budgets, there's a little room where you can talk about consultation, because you have salaries, you've got obligations that have been created, really flexible money that we can, as citizens, have a say on. We no longer have a voice, we no longer have a vote. So I would then again go and remove that. Could it have been avoided? Yes, let's avoid it. Yeah, it does not matter to say let's avoid it, but let's avoid it. This is dead because of the historical injustice, and even claim much more than that. So it also goes to the center of the issues that those crazy baldies, they must be sent back to China, sent back to Europe, sent back to, I mean, Africa should be African. So as I conclude, Zambia's problems are even worse than this issue of debt, the financial debt. The land has been taken by outsiders. Zambia, they are birthright. You know, in financial terms, land is the only asset that you cannot depreciate.
True.
It's the only asset that cannot suffer a loss like that. But the land, the birthright of Zambians, is being taken as we speak right now. Forget about this. There won't be any Zambia to talk to.
All right, quickly, the two of you, and then we move on because of time.
So, Kasiri mentioned the first thing I wanted to share, just remove what the whole president idea, but also in terms of trust, I think you put it as trusted comrades. In my country, one of the opposition leaders, Dr. Kiza Besigye, mentioned that the biggest problem in Uganda are the elites. So the elites, you think you know a lot because you've gone to school, you know all these numbers, you know all these big words. So I think the first thing I would do is to have a human-centered approach, and in that would be, you know how a population census is done? Go individual to individual of who lives in Zambia and ask them what development, what even financialization or economic growth means to them. And in that, you don't even have to go to your fellow president who you already share the same ideologies and the same politics, but get it from the people themselves. So we'll have, maybe we close Zambia for like a year and lock everyone out. Yeah, you take a holiday and just say, you know what, world, we're having a break and we are going to do this like the right way. We are going to do things the actual way. And depending on what people share, because like he earlier shared, the money is borrowed in our name, or things are done in our name that we have not asked for. And so ensuring that everything that you share is actually human-centered and is actually replicating and representative of what your people actually want. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiments expressed by the colleagues. My addition would be, you know, earlier Francis had that slide that showed the difference between the IFFs and the debt, and it was almost triple the amount. So for me, it would be the first thing is looking at analysis of where the leakages are, and looking at how is it that we're able to retrieve some of those leakages in order to be able to assist. I think secondly, one of the things that you mentioned now, when it comes to infrastructure projects, the inflation that happens in the process is really, really unethical. And a lot of it is very deliberate. Something is costed at $100, and the next thing at the end it's cost $1,000. And for me, it would be a process of really marking people as enemy of the state, going to retrieve, even if it means you blacklist people who are behind a lot of these infrastructure projects.
Whitelist them, not black.
Excuse me?
Whitelist them.
Yes, whitelist them, expel them, but ensure that you are able to retrieve, as you know, even if it means they go bankrupt, but go fetch almost reparations for them, because the inflations are really, really, it's not on. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So we're going to rephrase this question. So can the suggested model for Zambia be implemented? Oh no, this one will be afterwards. But can your financial model be implemented within the current political and social system in Zambia? Whatever we are talking about, is it implementable? And then maybe we can combine that. If change is required, what did it look like?
I just wanted to give an example from Naledi's point. In Uganda, I know that Idi Amin is seen as a really terrible person, but Idi Amin expelled Indians when he realized that they were exploiting and extracting from Ugandans. And we may not be the best country, but I know at that time all the narratives were the economy of Uganda is going to crash and all those things, but we are still here. So I think in answering that, it's possible. Maybe we just need the boobs to actually do it.
We should be radical, yes? Anyone else? Anyone else? Elijah?
Yeah, maybe I can just add. So I'm thinking about even our democracy. Maybe we can begin to redefine our democracy. So for now, like what is happening in Zambia at the moment, you know, because the economic situation is so bad now that the citizens are already changing their minds, right? I can bet you if you were to go to the maybe elections next year, and Edgar Lungu, the former president, he has come back into active politics. So not about 4 days ago, he went to appear before the Constitutional Court, and the way citizens were just cheering, you know, for him. So they already want him back, some of them. So I feel like even our political system, you know, so like now the current president is driven by like wanting to win the next elections, because we'll be having elections in 2026. So some of these good ideas, and he might have some of the good economic policies, but he can't implement them now because he has to make sure that he secures his, you know, the ticket for 2026. You know, and people, you know, the way we overwhelmingly voted for him in 2021, but just 3 years down the line, people already want to go back to the former president. So I feel like even our democracy, I don't know, our political system, maybe it's something that we also need to work on, because our citizens, no matter what, so we can have a good president, to be honest. Like in Zambia, we have very good options in terms of political leaders, but they can't win because of lack of popularity. So people they can't just vote for them, no matter how good they are sound economically, you know, they would even make good political leaders, but because they can't just vote for them. Then another thing is also have this, like the regional voting pattern. I think it's more prevalent even in Kenya. I think it's the same thing. Zambia, where we have, so no matter what, like Zambia is divided into two. So the one half, no matter what the current president can do, they will still not vote for him. And then we have the other half. So I think that's also another challenge in terms of leadership that we face in Africa. This tribal thing, the way, you know, just, okay, this is from my region, you know. So I think that also it's another dimension. So I don't know in designing a solution whether we can also consider the political system, the voting patterns, wanting to secure the next, I don't know what you would think about it, but I was just thinking about it, looking at what is going on in my country at the moment.
Yeah, because I don't think we consider the political culture that we have. Anyone else who wants to go? All right, Amelie, I would ask you to just read from the red part. You want to comment? All right.
I wanted to remind us that there was a good point that came out, that sometimes we think that we are in charge of our political systems. Let me remind you that we are not. There are people who there are systems that are set up for us because they work for them, not for us. And in thinking about even how we approach those systems, sometimes, you know, we beat our own people. We say, you know, they are tribal. They only think about the tribe. Let me remind you that we are pawns in a bigger game. Yeah, and these things, they know who will be president in the next elections. In Kenya, they set it up, and they knew this is what they wanted. So we must also always see it from the bigger perspective. And I'm happy that we are having a Pan-African conversation here, so that we do not only see our internal problems, but to realize that we fall within a big architecture. And part of what we are doing here is relearning how we need to be approaching it.
Good. Yes, Martin? Oh, okay. Oh, sorry.
Oh, thank you. I just want to agree very much with him, because actually we are in a big game. But we should be smart enough, when we know we are in a big game, to get these people whom we are facing fall, without them knowing that we know. Yes.
Sorry, I interrupted you, because when we are smart enough, it means that the Chinese, they use the Mandarin, right? The English, they use English, French, and here we are smart in English. We are smart in how the food we eat, the things that we do. So it's culture. I'm agreeing with you. Smart for me is not redefinition. It's about going back to who we are. Just to try to, sorry for that.
To confirm, that's what it means. It means that we Africans should come back to witchcraft, because witchcraft means that you can discuss as we are discussing now. We are using words that everyone can grab, but we still need another discussion when it is dark, where we then take the right decision for us to. That's the way we should go with it. If you don't do that, and that's how other people do to come and dominate us. Our leaders don't know how to do this. When they finish in Addis Ababa, that's all. They take their flight and go back home. It is wrong.
I think for me, I want to go back to the point that Francis mentioned. And I'm glad there's a Zambian, but maybe you were young. I was in Zambia then because I was in exile. Who convinced Zambians that KK was a bad president? Because when they took him out like a dog. Like he hadn't contributed anything. Because they whoop it up in the media such that by the time they take you out, the population is convinced that, excuse my language, you are a piece of shit. That's what they reduce you to. So people can't wait for you to go. But listen to what Francis shared. And he's Zambian, he can tell you. The person they were given after KK is the one that auctioned Zambia on a breakfast plate. Shiloh, he did it all. There's nothing he did not do under the sun. And then the fucker decided to die and leave the mess. If they didn't kill him, actually. Because once they are done using you, they put you in the grave. So who are these people that convince us somebody's bad? Naledi is here. It's a funny thing for South Africans because it's such a mental block because of what the media told us. And I'm glad I've never voted ANC in my entire life. I was last ANC when I was in the liberation movement. But it is a fact that during Zuma's time, there was no load shedding. And if there was, it was 0.1%. But we were convinced he's the latest, I don't know what. Then they gave us Ramaphosa, and Ramaphosa, all he wanted to do was sell off the things that he could lay his hands on and sell off. And then our load shedding just skyrocketed. So it's almost like we take one step back, two steps backwards, all the time, because once they see something, and I think I'm provoked by what he says, because even in the language in which we discuss, they are listening. It's just, Naledi that told me, that even your phone listens to you. So even as we are talking here, our phones are listening to us. So...
That is quite true, because with like TikTok, it actually gives you prompts depending on what you're talking about. Yeah. Sharon.
Yeah, it's just going off of what she said, and she was talking about how these narratives spread. And I remember the other day I was watching this video, and he was talking about my community in particular in Kenya, and he was speaking about a certain musician, you know, just how these cultural manifestations, how you don't even realize when you are starting to believe in a certain narrative. And I was just thinking about this particular musician, and he did it so almost unknowingly when you start taking a side of one political side, and you start spreading songs, and usually it's those people you think, well, they play a different role in society, like musicians, but you really don't realize when they are propagating a certain narrative, and that's what we're talking about, cultural manifestations. And it became so strong in the Mount Kenya region that it influenced a lot of things. But I had never thought about it, that I probably listened to this guy every week. Yeah. Oh, I loved his music. And I never realized what it was also doing to me. And I never questioned it. It was right there, but I could not see it. So I agree with what they are saying, that sometimes it's beyond you. The system is organized in such a way that even the ways in which, it's so subtle, it's so systemic that you don't even realize when it's creeping up on you. So you think, on the ballot day comes, you think, I voted because he's the person I want. You didn't realize that every day you are listening to music that was actually hardwiring you to actually believe in this narrative.
All right, so the last one. So
we have a cure for music. Just listen to Bob Marley. Don't
yes. So they say music shapes culture. Yeah. So the last one, so that I can see the other team is coming up.
One of the things I was thinking about in what if change is required, what would it look like? And I'm just thinking about the space we are in right now, MSTCDC, and thinking around, I'm a lawyer by training, but I denounced that legal part of me because I realized, like, the laws I studied, the things I was was taught were not things that were supposed to actually work for my people. And so think about, yes, there's a university, but having alternative spaces where we teach, like we redo, like we rewire the teaching that has been done to our education system and have people just think and reflect more critically about the world as it is. Yeah.
Right. So I'm assuming we've already.
Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Simply put, the rising interest rates we've seen across the world, that's still quite a bit, and Africa has really struggled with the recent rise in interest rates, not least because international investors basically stopped lending to Africa last year. This meant that many African countries were unable to roll over their debt, and is currently in talks with both the African Development Bank and the World Bank for budgetary support, and Tunisia, which has a debt-to-GDP ratio around 90%, but has refused IMF support sometime soon. Things are only going to get worse, because a lot of Africa's bond payments to the holder of that bond. But this year, in 2024, 10 years after the bond was issued, they have to pay back the full $2 billion. In other words, the bond is coming due. Anyway, because African countries borrowed a lot of money in the late 2010s, increased food prices and stoked political instability. Third, weak tax revenues have caused Western countries to cut their aid budgets, including Western financials, China and its complicated web of state-owned enterprises, and more recently Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who've stepped in to fill the gap left by post-pandemic decline, because they basically mean that countries like Zambia have to just sit it out on the sidelines until it's done. Now, it's important that there's a renewed demand for African debt. Nonetheless, it's still a precarious situation, and if interest rates stay high, pretty complicated, especially when we dive into economics and detailed data, which is why we use Brilliant.org to keep us sharp.
Here's a snippet from that interview that might help. The interviewer asked, what are the challenges and what steps do you think need to be taken?
So from our own analysis, I'm just basing it on that video. Is Africa's debt trap differing per country? Or is it the same story through and through? Yes.
Even those that consider themselves still may be in a better position, I think they are heading there.
Who owns Africa's debt? And I think this still goes back to the first video that we watched. Yeah. Yes.
Videos, it's quite clear that we have two super emerging powers, which was China and the West.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, those are the two that I identified.
I think I know the answer, but I want to be sure. I'm not an economist. When you say who owns African debt,
yeah,
please explain own.
Like,
because I've read books where they talk about getting a haircut for your loan or restructuring a loan. But from basic English, owning a debt means the one who has contracted that debt. So in this conversation, what do we mean by owns
no,
the
I
African
think from this
debt?
And I was checking the link. So I was saying that based on the link, on the information that we have in the link, there's actually a distribution of our creditors that might be helpful if you could access it and show to the rest of the team.
That without China being involved and bilateral debt, including China, then the growth in multilateral, then there's the private debt excluding China and private debt that includes China. So I think those are the key actors who are owed by African countries the most.
Is in a debt trap. They believe the issue in Kenya is how spending is being done. So they feel that there's a lot of wastage in the money that is borrowed to sort of run the run the economy in terms of projects, in terms of investments, and so on. So I think it's also worth understanding country by country cases around the notion of what exactly is a debt trap. There's the conventional wisdom that a debt trap, what it does, you are in a perpetual cycle of running deficits in across all your projects, and then in your balance sheet, right? Those types of traps are also as a result, they could be as a result of poor management of public resources in terms of where you invest. It could be that the return on investment in terms of revenue mobilization from those investments have a long maturity. So particularly infrastructure projects tend to have longer maturity rates in terms of when they start giving you returns. Or it could be that you are impacted by global conditions that affect your ability to raise enough money to fill those gaps. So what ends up happening is that you're in this perpetual cycle of borrowing, you're in this perpetual cycle of deficit financing, and so in one sense that allow you to come out of that are not in place. And I guess that's also why the country to country context is also useful for considering there. I think holistically, when you look at the continent in its interactions with the rest of the world, you could say there is a type of debt trap, because when we're still relatively exporters and producers of primary goods, we still work on the notion that we need to do export-led growth and development rather than production for domestic consumption. Right? So we still feel that we need to, because we rely on that dollar reserve. So there's also that trap that is being created, that we are constantly looking at export-led as opposed to inward consumption-driven development and industrialization from within. So I think also when, again, just talking about whether we are truly in a debt trap, we could consider it in those circumstances as well.
But it's just a comment on the debt trap situation in Africa in general. And it's to say that although context matters, as the first guy in the video was saying, if the countries have already defaulting, they're about to default. In general terms, they all contracted huge debts when the interest rates were low. And these debts are due in the next, from 2024
to
to
2032.
Exactly. So they are due soon. So in the medium term, even they are in the same situation in terms of, they have challenges with that. So although context matters, I would say that the situation of that, as he was putting, is critical for all countries. Yeah.
Would you argue that those two can coexist at the same time? We can be in a debt trap and still be, what was the language you used? The analysts, they said we are not in a debt trap. Spending issue. It can coexist at the same time. Those two can exist.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't agree with the conclusion.
No, yeah.
I don't agree with their conclusion. It's just a perspective that they have presented in terms of saying not to be too alarmist of what is happening in Kenya. That is the basic definition of a debt trap. So it's beyond.
When you add up the total nugatory expenditure, nugatory, like like what government has spent on that is not useful, vis-a-vis what we are supposed to pay as debt, like to service our financial obligations, it's way beyond. So that's why they believe it's not actually the debt that has pushed our governments to run out of liquidity to offer the various services, but rather the fiscal, not really fiscal, but the budgetary indiscipline, like the spending patterns of government, that even when we didn't have debt, we shall still have problems as a nation because of how we spend. Yeah.
100%.
Yes, I think we still have two more tasks. Third one being this fact sheet that you have to go through. As you can see, Africa's external debt has amounted to 775 billion USD in 2020, compared to 3,000 billion USD in 2010. So meaning it has grown more than twofold over that 10-year period. Then African countries' tax to GDP ratios hover around 15%, which is the lowest in the world, and half the tax to GDP rate of OECD countries. And I think this is something that Francis touched on when he was doing his presentation on how we are doing in terms of revenue mobilization as African countries. And of course, African countries will pay 89 billion USD in external debt service in 2024. You are the newly elected chair of the AU. You are with a committee of 10 ministers of finance, otherwise referred to as the F10. Construct a viable financial model for Africa to take her out of her debt distress. Private debt just from China. Then this is light blue, right? So this is multilateral. And then the black, I hope this is black. It's bilateral debt just from China. And then this one is cumulatively bilateral debt, but excluding bilateral debt from China. So you can see how, no, just China. Yeah, just China.
Well, African countries should reduce borrowing, and especially private creditors. If at all there is need to borrow, it should be from multilateral at concessional rates, multilateral development banks, multilateral institutions, if at all they have to borrow. But the alternative to borrowing is increasing domestic resource mobilization. And here, it's not only going to be tax alone, but rather developing production, trade, especially leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement that has been signed and is operational. So increase in trade among African countries will lead to generate more revenues, and then domestic revenue mobilization through production in agricultural inputs and natural resources, and then adding value to natural resources that they have without continue to be an exporter of commodities. Rather, finished products. African countries should concentrate on exporting finished products and not raw materials. Then we have seen that the tax to GDP ratio is low. It's quite low in African countries, quite all right. Then once you have increased production and there is an inter-African trade to boost revenue, that will lead to employment of citizens, employment of youths, and therefore it will be easy to increase tax, widen the tax net so that enough revenue will be generated to offset the pending debts.
Requesting, the global financial architecture to be reformed a little bit, or currently, many countries in Africa are in a liquidity problem. So I would see it from the short term and from medium to long term point of view. From the short term, we need to resolve the liquidity challenge of many African countries. Like you said, in your presentation, you showed us, I think many African countries, about 70, 80 billion a year they would pay for debt servicing, right? So that would crowd out resources from health, from education. So I think one immediate solution is to ease that burden on African countries. And one way to do that is debt restructuring. So there needs to be a consensus to restructure the current debt, so that the governments will not be pressured too much to pay too much in the short term. So that would mean 10, 20 years of postponing the SDR reallocation last time. And one of the recommendations we come up with is there is excess reserve of SDR among the developed countries, because the SDR allocation itself is a biased. It's allocated more to the countries that need least SDR. So there needs to be a way to rechannel that excess reserve from developed countries to countries like Africa who needs it most. So that will give African countries a relief in the medium term to invest in development, to invest in their exports. So that's from the external side. But from within, from Africa, we need to also discipline ourselves in terms of when we borrow. So for example, you also showed that the dates in the last 10 years more than doubled, the African dates, right? And that's the same in Ethiopia. If you consider my country, Ethiopia, it's the same. It's more than doubled in the last 10 years. And that's because we borrow a lot in the last 10 years from countries like China. We're not sure about the return of this investment, whether we will be able to pay back the debt. So sometimes, the governments, they are short-sighted. They want to show us, something so that they can sustain their power, but they are not considerate of the burden they are creating in the country. So sometimes when you borrow, you need to do it in a responsible way. You need to, manage the way you are borrowing. But we did it, aggressively in the last 10 years. Now we cannot handle that, right? So there needs to be some kind of discipline when we borrow. So as AU chairperson, I will also try to, advocate that our member countries need to be disciplined when it comes to borrowing. I can't think of this kind of things.
To see how much is owed, and the money that we had borrowed, how was it used, to whose benefit was it used for? And then maybe around the issue of debt transparency, you did pose a question around whether it's possible with the current political and social structure.
Yeah.
I think it's a bit difficult, because for some countries the political will doesn't exist. So I'm not really sure of the way around that when it comes to debt transparency.
Admire that we are in, largely because we have largely liberalized our economies. So perhaps moving towards a more protectionist approach in running our economies would, I'm guessing this is just a rough thought at the top of my head, probably taking up a protectionist model that then allows us to have an uptake of our local goods and services at the end of the day, that we're not necessarily dependent on too much external interference. I think that is one of the quote-unquote policies I would recommend for the financial model that we're trying to set up.
Then I think the other thing also is on just how the national parliament will interface with
Implementation. Of course, the current political and socio-economic structures need to change.
Yeah.
Of course, that speaks to the goodwill and all that, but how parliaments would interface with this, they're involved in approvals. So when we talk about no borrowing beyond a certain point, they're in charge. I don't know about other countries, but I know for Kenya, Parliament has a role to approve the debt that they need to approve the levels. I think we also talked about they need also to oversight. So when we say we have a spending problem, so again, Parliament is in charge of that. It's also in charge of the budget.
Yeah.
So that takes care of the deficits, and that also dictates how much we borrow. So I think those are the ways Parliament would interface with that model.
yes, yeah, because you want to implement this system, yeah, this financial model, because I think that ties to this question on whether it can be implemented in the current political and socioeconomic structure. Yeah.
Of course, there's something I was challenged with in the morning, that during the election years, there are visits our presidents do that will surely determine who is the next president.
Yeah.
So that's what actually shows me, maybe is it is the power over the president in place, is it because we citizens have chosen the president, or there is an extra hand that has implanted the person that is actually leading us? So now when I think about that, it actually triggers my mind on whether it is easy to say no to borrowing. Because I've seen a number of loans where the creditors themselves come to countries and they're like, say for instance, they'll come to Uganda and they tell them, get this loan. There was that specific loan on gender something, implementing gender, yeah, and it was imposed on us during the election year. But anyway, why would we be borrowing to actually institute our own cultures or change the mindset of our communities, but rather to borrow for things that would spur trade, like what we said yesterday? So it actually triggers my mind on whether we can move out of the trap. But from the morning session that we had on illicit finance and the UN tax conversion, when you see how the tax group has progressed towards reform of the OECD structures, okay, it really gives me hope that even with debt, we can still advocate and push for our agenda, however much it would take so much long time. So back to the question on how much change it would require, we can only start with having our own monies as Africa. Yeah. So if we have our own monies, like he said, the DRM, but of course counteracting illicit finance. You saw the figures for Zambia, they were really shocking. How much debt they have and how much money they were losing in illicit financial flows. So, yeah.
African countries should dismantle any barrier in movement within Africa. In terms of just as an economic bloc, like the EU, you have to enter for me to get a visa to South Africa, it takes a rigorous process. So we need to dismantle these barriers. Even with the structures are in place, you have the AU, you have the African Economic Commission, you have the after the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. So you see that there is need for Africans to dismantle every barrier that inhibits movement and free trade. In that way, you will see that Africans will be able to trade among themselves and be able to exchange ideas and grow their economies.
If change is required, how would that look like? I think it's important that the public is meaningfully engaged in these processes, and they can only be engaged if they understand and they know what's happening. So there needs to be political will to do meaningful civic education, breaking down of jargon like we had in the session with Christo in the morning, so that people know what they are challenging, what they are questioning, and what is in those documents in the simplest ways that they can digest that kind of information.
Yeah.
To meet their obligations of
In terms of development finance institutions, we can think of IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, the Chinese Import-Export Bank, which are the major lenders to African countries. So yeah, each of them have their own merits and demerits, but I think, in my view, the African Development Bank is well positioned to lend to African countries because, for one thing, they have their local expertise in different countries, and usually, if you see their track record, I think they have been successful in terms of their lending and in terms of the impact of their lending. The other thing is their conditionality is much lower and much looser than the IMF and the World Bank. So that would benefit many countries which otherwise wouldn't have access, credit from other global financial institutions. So in my view, the African Development Bank is it's my preferred candidate. And I think that's also the position of the African heads of states in, I think, if I remember correctly, 2 years ago, they were championing for this, more international resources should be channeled to the African development banks rather than the other, the IMF and the World Bank. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. Can we ask for the scribers to summarize in a minute? Because I think the learning points happened at the breakaway sessions. So here what you tell us, it was they call it the Kairos moment. What new thing did you learn through the exercise? Just summarize it for us for a minute. Who were the scribers in the... Yes, come please. Come so we can see you and appreciate you.
Thank you so much. So we as the Africans, we first of all, about the first question was saying, is the debt trap the same across Africa or it's independent per country? We had two options as we viewed the question, but our first answer was, yes, it is the same, because when you're to look at all African countries, we are suffering the debt burden, and for those countries that think are not worse off, are also heading to the same debt trap. Then, in our other opinion, we looked at it being viewed as per country because we all face different issues as per the debt. We have different debt figures, and also this is concerned with different factors. For example, you gave an example of Kenya, that some people don't believe Kenya is under the debt trap, but rather question their spending. And we saw there could be factors influencing that. For example, the poor management of investments. They could have invested their loans in some investments that would have returns maybe in the future. The maturity time is so long. Yeah. Then we also saw that there are some global conditionalities that affect different countries that could keep them in the debt traps. We went to the other question of being elected as the AU chairperson to come up with a financial model. First of all, the model, how it would look like. It would be one with reduced borrowing from private creditors, advising member countries to have their loans from multilateral creditors. Yeah. Then the other thing, we would also have domestic revenue mobilization as a way of substituting borrowing. And also, we would also encourage African continental free trade, like amongst our African countries, to help us with the what? To help us with the so much conditions that come along with the loans we get from outside Africa. Then we also would advise to add value to our natural resources so that we could export products that are of more quality so that they could attract more prices in the international markets. Then we also would advise the excess DRS by those top countries so that they could rechannel it to with the African countries that don't have much liquidity, so that we could use that money as an option of helping us develop. The second, the third? Then also, our model would be one that would encourage us to be disciplined when it comes to debt management in a way of meeting our obligations, and also to borrow what we can be able to pay. Yes. Then also we talked of debt auditing per country, per the member countries. We would have an individual country audit to see what this debt did and who benefited from it. Then, what would be the Parliament's role in this model? We've seen that the role would be to oversee and also approve these loans before they are gotten. The Parliament should approve their acquisition and also oversee the budgeting process and be in charge of all that, the implementation, and also move on to assess for accountability on what the money was used for. Then another question was, can the financial model be implemented within the current political and socio-economic structure as well as governance system of the AU? The answer was yes. How could we do that? We could first of all set strategies to first have our own money so that we leave the other continents and have our own money as Africa, so that we would not need much from them. By that, we would have cut off the conditionalities that come with their money so that we do what we want. Then also, yes, we would have our money as we also check the illicit financial flows so that we can have our domestic revenue mobilization taken to higher levels. Yes. Then also we would encourage free trade within the AU member countries. We would encourage trade so that would be an option and a substitute for having to trade with those other countries. Then also, we talked of having civic education. We also talked of having civic education with citizens, since it's all about the citizens. Yes, so that we teach them how important this new model would be, and also how to work it out in the best of our target. Then about if change is required, what would you like it to look like? I would like it to meet the obligations, to meet its obligations, as in each country to meet their obligations. Yes. Then for the institution, we would like, of course, to work with the African Development Bank, since we think it could come with fewer conditionalities compared to those other creditors of ours. And then also, since it's within Africa. That was it. Thank you.
She spoke so much, and that's such a lame clapping. So, with the other group, just focus on the model. I think it will save us time. As the rapporteur comes, I am just posing rhetoric questions. The Africa group say they can implement all that radical transformation that they advocated within the parliamentary systems of Africa as they are. Now, lawyers, you said it's implementable within, but you then said we will do this, this, this. So my thing is, then it means it cannot be as they are. It means they need to change somewhere for them to internalize what we are proposing. Because when we say as they are, I hope we know that for former French colonies, it is the French currency that dominates. That's why they are even called Francophone. For the English, it's called Anglo-American money. That's why it's Britain and America that jumps, whatever happens there. For the former Portuguese, you never know. It's a marriage between Spain, Portugal, and Italy. It becomes a marriage, you know, and then Belgium gets roped in somehow. So it's a rhetoric one. We want to see you. We like you. Just go on the model straight, ne?
Okay, thank you very much. 1 second, please. So our group was looking at Zambia's debt restructuring program, and as we were looking to then design the somehow what would have been the solution if we were the president, we highlighted few problems, including bad governance and accountability, but also the fact that the structure of our economies has nothing to do with our actual needs. Part of the group agreed that yes, it could have been avoided if indeed there is more transparency, less corruption or no corruption, and good governance. But another part of the group disagreed, saying that if we look also at illicit financial flows and the difficulties of recovery of stolen assets, that would have been difficult. So as a result, it is critical that we turn the table and actually not demand a seat on the table, but be ready to take the table. So in regard to the design, the consensus, the general consensus was around getting in touch with the people to jointly discuss how to get out of the debt and to collectively decide that this debt is too heavy for us and to simply stop paying the debt, as a matter of fact, to void the debt due to historical injustices and actually claim more than that. So if we look at this suggested model, can we see it being implemented in the current political and social economic system? Unfortunately not, because we need to redefine and look at democracy and political systems, but also take into consideration tribalism, ethnicity, among other factors. And then there is a need as well to refine the narrative, acknowledging that these systems are not set up for us and that these work for them and not for us. And for the last question about which development finance institution would you prefer to do business with? None. Thank you.
And that was on the dot. And the clapping is so lame. All right. So Jason is looking at me right now. But we will end John. So, but we will take 2 minutes and wind up, John. So, you were robbed of this exercise because I was told you are going to have prior learning for 3 weeks. So, I used the appreciative inquiry model. You were supposed to have discovered your own parliamentary systems in the 3 weeks before you came here. So, you were sent questions. So, when you came here, you were being allowed to dream big and redesign so that we have a better destiny. Well, it didn't happen because it's almost like we hijacked you. We asked you questions that were not based on previous work that you would have done. But I can conclude and tell you that as you sit here as countries, you run different parliamentary systems in your countries. And I can tell you that some encourage lack of transparency and corruption. Some are not that open, but they go a little way to promote transparency. It's embedded in the system itself. Another second thing we highlighted in the Zambia group is that the Zambian debt was accumulated with a previous president. But when you say it's a new government, haven't you heard us use those terms? It's a new government that's taking on for the next 5 years, but you inherit everything that comes with the system. So, are we really running parliamentary systems or are we running just a system is the question I want to leave you with. Then we made an example. For instance, when South Africa started in '94, we still inherited the apartheid debt. I mean, if that doesn't make you fall off your chair, I don't know what will. And there are many countries here who inherited the colonial debt too. When Ghana was told to be free in '57, they took the state together with whatever was in the coffers or was not in the coffers. So we did this exercise so that we can see the bigger picture. That debt is not just hanging on its own. It is embedded within a system. Those systems are not the same for all of us, but they have one end game, which is why the indebtedness is the same for all of us. So I hope you learned something. When you go back, do me a favor, because I had asked you, what is the name of your parliamentary system? And the question had said, don't look it up, first guess it and then look it up and see if your answer matches what in reality it is. And I can tell you, without you having done the exercise, a lot of people can't name what parliamentary system they are running in their country. They just know we vote after every 5 years. The nitty-gritties of it, they do not understand. So do yourself a favor when you go back, please do learn it. I can tell you that in South Africa, there's only one party that calls for the electoral change. And it's a very minute, small party that nobody even knows it exists. The rest of them are happy with the status quo. So they just want to be the next people that sit there and take the debts on our behalf. So we will end this session in the fashion that it deserves so that you wake up for Stefano. May we all stand. So we are not going to explain, you will just play along with us. The energy is so low, I don't know if we were overfed, so we will try and raise the momentum because Stefano is online so that we don't sleep when he presents. Amandla! I'm not so sure, unless we don't know what it means. You don't know what it means? Oh, you know, yeah, it means power to the people. Power is not ours. It's not parliamentary too. It's the people's. Amandla. 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 Viva Aphrodite, viva. No. Did you pay them? You already gave them. No, it tells when you say viva, they say viva. When you say down, they say down. They have such an easy task. Viva Aphrodite, viva. Viva. Viva Aphrodite, viva. Viva. Viva Aphrodite, viva. Viva. Long live to multinationals who pay their fair share of tax in Africa. Long live. Down with multinationals who do tax evasion and tax avoidance in Africa. Down. Down with profit shifting in Africa. Down. Down with price collusion in Africa. Down. Forward to an Africa that is engaged in domestic resources mobilization. Forward. Forward to an Africa where members of parliament hold the executive accountable. Forward. Forward to an Africa where members of parliament unite across political party to end poverty in Africa. Forward. Forward to an Africa that is united, non-racial, non-sexist, non-ethnic, non-patriarchal, non-homophobic. Forward. Forward to a united, prosperous Africa. Forward. Amandla. 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 Long live the liberating spirit of Kwame Nkrumah. Long live. Long live the uniting spirit of Kenneth Kaunda. Long live. Long live the African spirit of Julius Nyerere. Long live. Long live the economic policies of Thomas Sankara. Long live. Long live the liberating spirit of Amilcar Cabral. Long live. Long live the spirit of Stephen Bantu Biko, which was community rooted. Long live. I'm sure there is nobody that you do not know there. If there is, there's just one, maybe Amilcar Cabral. For those who don't, please look him up. Now, the next bet, which is what we're gonna end up with, are names you might not have heard, but they are part of this history as much as the Nyereres and the Nkrumahs are. Long live the spirit of Ya Asantewa, who fought against British colonialism in Ghana. Long live. Long live the spirit of Nehanda Nyagasigana, who fought against British colonialism in Zimbabwe. Long live. Long live the spirit of Vita Kimba, who fought against Catholicism that attacked and destroyed the empire of the Congo with a K. Long live. To founders of the only surviving matriarchal reign kingdom in Southern Africa. Long live. Long live the spirit of the Black Panther, Saronia, the queen that shapeshifted into a panther to avert being guillotined by the French in front of all her people. Long live. Long live. Now, in our group, we talked about witchcraft, Jason, and that we need it back. Now, this was witchcraft in operation. Yes, yeah, this was witchcraft in operation. If you go and you look at the Azna people today of Niger, if you go on Google and you say religion of Niger, it will tell you 90 whatever percent Islam, and it will tell you 1 point whatever percent African traditional religion. Those are Saronia's people, the Azna people. The Arabs couldn't conquer them in 9 centuries since 639. The French couldn't conquer them in 1400. When they arrested her, stripped her naked, brought her in front of all her people to guillotine her, she shape-shifted into a panther and disappeared into the forest. That's the witchcraft you talked about, which we want back. Thank you so much.